Europe. The 1930s. After World War I, it was supposed to be the end of history, the end of wars. It should have been the triumph of liberal democracy over authoritarianism. But the clock was ticking, and the thread holding the world together was about to snap. Economic hardship led to a loss of faith in government. With the tragic loss of a generation, leaders began urging a return to tradition, for women to return to the home and have children. The spread of communism, instead of easing economic tensions, spawned fear in the middle and upper classes, as they instead looked to strongmen to take the helm as a bulwark against it. By the end of the decade, the only major nations to remain democratic were the United Kingdom and France. The others, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Eastern Europe, had all fallen into dictatorship. Soon, totalitarianism emerged, garnering even more power than authoritarian regimes. This was exemplified in three major states. After World War I, Italy faced severe economic problems, including high unemployment, inflation, and a burden of war debts. Though Italy was part of the winning side, laying claim to former Austro-Hungarian territories, its government was weak and fragmented, with frequent changes in leadership and ineffective coalition governments. There was widespread dissatisfaction with the liberal political system, and the war had left Italian society deeply divided. Socialists and communists gained support among the working class and peasants, while conservative and nationalist groups feared a socialist revolution. In 1919, Benito Mussolini, a former socialist journalist who became more radicalized during World War I, founded the Italian Fasces of Combat, which later became the National Fascist Party. The party's platform combined nationalism, militarism, and anti-socialism. The term fascism has its roots in the Italian word fascismo, which itself is derived from the Latin word fasces. In ancient Rome, the fasces were a bundle of rods typically surrounding an axe, symbolizing the authority of the magistrates. It displayed unity and strength through the combination of individual rods into a single, unbreakable bundle. Mussolini organized the Blackshirts, or squadristi, paramilitary groups to use violence and intimidation against socialists, communists, and trade unions. The Blackshirts carried out violent attacks, strikes, and demonstrations to create a sense of chaos and disorder. Mussolini made strategic alliances with conservative politicians, the military, and the monarchy, positioning himself as a defender of law and order. In October 1922, Mussolini and his followers organized the March on Rome, a mass demonstration intended to intimidate the government into giving them power. Thousands of fascists converged on Rome, demanding that Mussolini be appointed prime minister. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war and believing that Mussolini could restore order, refused to declare martial law and instead invited Mussolini to form a government, and on October 31st, Mussolini was appointed Prime Minister of Italy. Over the next few years, Mussolini gradually dismantled democratic institutions and established a dictatorship. He passed laws that gave him extensive powers, suppressed political opposition, and controlled the media. By the mid-1920s, Mussolini had established a regime under the Fascist Party, declaring himself Il Duce, the leader, and eliminated all political opposition. Mussolini deemed his state totalitarian, seeking to control nearly every aspect of public and private life. Totalitarian regimes often employed extensive surveillance, propaganda, and state terror to achieve this level of control. But despite their efforts, old Italian institutions remained separate, like the Catholic Church and the monarchy, which held control over the military. Just to the north of Italy, totalitarianism became much more total. At the end of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II was exiled, and the German Empire dissolved. In its place, the newly established Weimar Republic faced significant challenges, including political instability, economic crisis, and a lack of popular support. One of those who had fought in the Great War was an Austrian with superb oratory skills, Adolf Hitler. Still enlisted in the army, he was sent to gather intelligence on an obscure political organization based in Munich, the German Workers' Party, or DAP. It was still a fringe group with limited membership, primarily composed of disgruntled World War I veterans, radical nationalists, and anti-communists. But Hitler came to agree with a lot of the nationalist and anti-Marxist rhetoric. He later joined the party, and by 1921 rose the ranks and took control, renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP. From the German pronunciation of the first part of their name, we get the term Nazi. Hitler turned the old DAP from a small debate club into a political movement. The term National Socialist was meant to broaden their appeal, especially among the working classes. But instead of Marxist socialism to unify workers, National Socialism instead emphasized unity among all racially pure Germans, transcending class differences for the sake of national unity. In just 2 years, membership went from the hundreds to the tens of thousands. Taking cues from Mussolini and Fascist Italy, Hitler adopted their Roman salute, which we now associate with the Nazis. Despite claims that the salute originated in ancient Rome, there is sparse evidence for this, and its prominence in the fascist movement is mostly attributed to Gabriele D'Annunzio, an Italian poet and aristocrat. Hitler also attempted to mirror Mussolini's coup, the March on Rome, with his own governmental takeover. In 1923, around 2,000 Nazis descended on the city center of Munich, with the goal of taking the city as a base to launch a march on the Weimar government. But the coup, called the Beer Hall Putsch, failed, and Hitler was arrested soon after. During his imprisonment, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, outlining his political ideology, which included extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and the desire for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. He also came to the conclusion that the Nazi Party would have to come to power by legal means, not by overthrowing the government in a coup. Although the coup failed and Hitler was imprisoned, it brought significant national attention to the Nazi Party and its leader. Upon his release, he reorganized the party, and by 1929, it was expanded all over Germany. The Nazi Party propagated the idea that the Weimar Republic was a Jewish republic, blaming Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I and subsequent economic and social troubles. This fact was exploited to suggest that Jews had disproportionate influence over the Weimar government. Furthermore, the fear of Bolshevism, exacerbated by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the Spartacist uprising in Germany, led to the Nazi portrayal of the Republic as weak and unable to protect Germany from a communist revolution. Nazi propaganda fused anti-Semitism and anti-communism into the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, suggesting a conspiracy between Jews and communists to destroy Germany. Hitler frequently linked Jews and communists in his speeches and writings, resonating with many Germans disillusioned with the Weimar Republic. Similar to the black shirts in Italy, the Nazis relied on their own paramilitary wing, the SA, or brown shirts, that used violence and intimidation against political opponents. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, but they did not have an outright majority. Political instability continued, with frequent changes in government and no party able to secure a stable majority. Key conservative leaders, including former Chancellor von Papen and President Paul von Hindenburg, believed they could control Hitler and use his popularity to stabilize the government. Despite initial reluctance, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor on January 30, 1933. And so, Hitler and the Nazi Party became head of government using the democratic Weimar framework, without a coup. With the Nazis in power, this was the start of the Third German Empire, the Third Reich. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, allegedly set by a lone Dutch communist, was blamed on the entire Communist Party and used by Hitler to push for the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents. After the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933, Adolf Hitler was granted dictatorial powers, allowing him to enact laws without parliamentary approval. This act effectively dismantled the democratic structure of the Weimar Republic and is often considered the start of Nazi Germany. The Nazis quickly moved to eliminate political opposition, banning political parties, dissolving trade unions, and arresting or killing opponents. In June 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered the purge of the SA leadership and other potential rivals, consolidating his control over the military and the Nazi Party. Following President Hindenburg's death in August 1934, Hitler combined the roles of Chancellor and President, assuming the title of Führer and becoming the undisputed leader of Germany. With the parliamentary state dissolved, Hitler established a totalitarian regime entirely under Nazi control. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a massive campaign to glorify Hitler and promote Nazi ideology. The regime controlled all media, including newspapers, radio, film, and literature, ensuring a uniform message across the nation. The Gestapo, secret state police, and the SS, originally Hitler's personal bodyguards, played crucial roles in maintaining control through surveillance, intimidation, and elimination of dissent. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, became a powerful organization overseeing the police, concentration camps, and security forces. Political opponents, including communists, socialists, and trade unionists, were brutally suppressed, and the concentration camp system expanded to imprison and eliminate those who opposed the regime. Hitler's image was cultivated as the infallible leader and savior of Germany, with loyalty to him being a central aspect of Nazi ideology and his image omnipresent in public life. The 1936 Olympics were held in Berlin in August. These games became highly political, serving as a propaganda tool for Hitler and the Nazi regime to showcase the supposed superiority of the Aryan race and the strength of Nazi Germany. The event was marked by grandiose displays of Nazi symbolism and extensive use of modern technology for broadcasting, making it the first Olympics to be televised. The Germans did win the total medal count, but despite the regime's intentions, the Games were instead highlighted by the achievements of African-American athlete Jesse Owens, who won gold medals in track and field, undermining the Nazi racial ideology. But the hosting of both the Summer and earlier Winter Games in 1936 restored Germany's pride on the world stage. The regime sought to indoctrinate the population from a young age. The education system was overhauled to emphasize racial purity, nationalism, and loyalty to Hitler. Youth organizations, such as the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, were used to inculcate these values in the younger generation. Though women were allowed to work in certain fields like nursing or social work, they were expected to primarily be bearers of children and housekeepers. The regime imposed strict controls on culture, including art, music, theater, and film, to ensure they aligned with Nazi values. Weimar Germany was the center of the European modern artistic movements, like the Bauhaus, but modernist and avant-garde art were condemned as degenerate. From July to November 1937, the Degenerate Art Exhibition was organized as part of a broader campaign to vilify and eliminate modern art that did not align with Nazi ideology and aesthetic values. Modern art movements such as Expressionism, Dadaism, Cubism, and Surrealism were condemned as reflective of a morally decayed society. The exhibition, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, featured artworks confiscated from German museums and private collections. The display was deliberately chaotic, with paintings and sculptures, accompanied by derogatory graffiti and labels mocking the artists and their work. The exhibition attracted over 2 million visitors, generating significant public interest and inadvertently exposing many to modern art for the first time. Following the exhibition, many of the artworks were destroyed, sold abroad, or hidden away, as the Nazis continued their campaign of cultural repression. The Nazis instead promoted a conservative and classical aesthetic that celebrated traditional Germanic values and German nationalism. They promoted traditional techniques and subjects that were easily understandable and depicted in a clear, literal manner. Approved subjects included landscapes, portraits, depictions of the German peasantry, soldiers, and glorification of the Aryan race. This concept of the Aryan race was a central tenet of Nazi ideology, combining pseudoscientific racial theories with mythological and historical references to create a narrative of racial superiority. The idea of the Aryan race emerged from 19th-century linguistic and anthropological studies. Over time, these linguistic theories were distorted into racial theories, with the Aryan being portrayed as the original, superior race that spread civilization across Europe and Asia. This pseudo-scientific idea was increasingly linked to the belief in the racial superiority of Europeans, particularly Northern Europeans. The Völkisch movement in Germany and Austria emerged near the turn of the century, embracing the idea of Aryan racial superiority. This movement combined nationalism, racial purity, and a romanticized view of ancient Germanic culture. The Aryan myth became central to Völkisch ideology, with the belief that the Germanic peoples were the purest descendants of the Aryan race. This ideology often included anti-Semitic and anti-Slavic elements. The Nazis drew heavily on Norse and Germanic mythology to build their racial ideology, using figures like Thor and Odin, as well as the heroic sagas of the Norse gods and warriors, to exemplify Aryan virtues of strength, bravery, and purity. The medieval Teutonic knights and other Germanic warriors were romanticized as precursors to the Nazi movement, symbolizing a pure and noble Aryan past. The swastika, an ancient symbol used in various cultures including Hinduism and Buddhism, was adopted by the Nazis as the emblem of the Aryan race and the Nazi Party. Though used in the West as a symbol of good luck, one of the first significant uses linking the swastika with anti-Semitism is attributed to the Germanenorden, a German nationalist and anti-Semitic secret society founded in 1912. An offshoot of the Germanenorden was the occultist Tula Society, named after a mythical northern realm, which continued using the swastika as a nationalist symbol. This society was more political and sponsored the German Workers' Party, which eventually became the Nazis. The swastika was officially adopted by the Nazi Party in 1920, with a design featuring a black swastika within a white circle on a red background. The Nazis also appropriated runes and other symbols from Germanic and Norse traditions to evoke a sense of ancient Aryan heritage and power. Massive public works projects, such as the construction of the Autobahn, and military rearmament programs were implemented to reduce unemployment and prepare for conflict. While the Nazis allowed private ownership and profit-making, they exerted significant control over the economy. Industrialists and businesses were expected to align with state goals, particularly in the rearmament effort. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 institutionalized racial discrimination against Jews, stripping them of citizenship and prohibiting marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. These were in part based on discriminatory laws in the United States at the time, but ended up far beyond their American precedents. Jews were increasingly marginalized, persecuted, coerced to emigrate, and eventually imprisoned or targeted for extermination. The laws eventually expanded to other groups, and soon, the regime persecuted other undesirables, including Romani people, Afro-Germans, disabled individuals, political dissidents, homosexuals, and others. These groups faced discrimination, forced sterilization, imprisonment, and death. On November 7, 1938, a young Polish Jew shot and fatally wounded a German diplomat in Paris. The Nazi regime used their diplomat's death as a pretext to incite a violent pogrom against Jews. On the night of November 9, 1938, Nazi paramilitary forces, both the SA and SS, and German civilians, attacked Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, and institutions in a coordinated and widespread assault. Over 200 synagogues were destroyed, and thousands of Jewish-owned shops and homes were ransacked and looted. The name Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, refers to the shards of broken glass that littered the streets from the smashed windows. Cemeteries, schools, and hospitals were also targeted and vandalized. Around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, where many were subjected to brutal treatment. In the aftermath, the remaining Jews in Germany faced increasing pressure to emigrate as the country entered a new and more violent era of anti-Semitism and persecution. Alongside Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany was another totalitarian state, although this took a different form. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the only legal party, and all political power was concentrated in its hands. The party controlled the government, the military, and all aspects of society. Stalin, the Soviet leader, developed a cult of personality, presenting himself as the infallible head of state and the embodiment of Soviet strength and unity. His image was omnipresent, and he was portrayed as a genius and savior of the nation. The state controlled all aspects of the economy through central planning. The first five-year plan in 1928 and second five-year plan in 1933 aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union and collectivize agriculture. Industrial goods and oil production increased substantially, but private farms were eliminated, replaced with collective and state farms. This process was accompanied by significant violence and resulted in widespread famine, particularly the Holodomor in Ukraine, where 3.5 to 5 million perished from the policies. The NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, played a central role in maintaining state terror and enforcing Stalin's policies. It conducted mass surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and executions. During the Great Purge, up to 1.2 million people, including party members, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, were executed or sent to the Gulag labor camps in Siberia. The purges aimed to eliminate potential rivals and dissenters and consolidate Stalin's power. The old Bolsheviks were the first to go, along with Trotsky supporters. Trotsky himself was assassinated in his Mexico City home during exile in 1940. Many European intellectuals, artists, and left-wing sympathizers who had previously admired the Soviet experiment became disillusioned as reports of the purges reached the West. Given the priorities of the five-year plans and the drive for rapid industrialization, there was a strong emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. Technical skills were crucial for building the industrial base and advancing military capabilities. Though easy access to education led to more social mobility, the Stalinist era remained oppressive. Over in Japan, the 1920s had remained moderate during the era of Taisho diplomacy. But Japan's parliamentary system was characterized by frequent changes in government between the two main parties, the moderate center-left Minseito and the moderate center-right Rikken Seiyukai. This fragmentation made it difficult for civilian leaders to effectively address the country's problems and weaken public confidence in democratic institutions. Corruption scandals and perceived incompetence further eroded trust in the civilian government. The global economic downturn of the Great Depression in 1929 severely affected Japan's economy. Exports plummeted, and unemployment soared, leading to widespread social unrest and dissatisfaction with the government's ability to manage the crisis. Many farmers and rural communities faced extreme poverty and hardship, exacerbating social tensions and making radical solutions more appealing. Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi managed to slash prices in order to restore export levels. But more Japanese became disillusioned, and ultranationalists were galvanized. On May 15, 1932, a group of young naval officers assassinated the Prime Minister, advocating for a more aggressive foreign policy and greater military control over the government. A string of assassinations ensued, targeting those promoters of Shidahara diplomacy, a policy promoting peace and pacifism during the 1920s. The powerful industrial conglomerates, or zaibatsu, had close ties with the military and provided them with significant economic and political support, facilitating Japan's rise in militarism. The Japanese military enjoyed a degree of autonomy from civilian control, with the army and navy ministers having direct access to the next emperor, Hirohito. This independence allowed military leaders to pursue their own agendas. A strong sense of nationalism and belief in Japan's destiny as a leading Asian power fueled militaristic ambitions. Military leaders, industrialists, and nationalists believed that Japan needed to expand its territory to secure resources and living space, particularly in East Asia. This expansionist vision was seen as essential for Japan's survival and prosperity. Though much of Southeast Asia was still the domain of the British, French, Dutch, and Americans, there was widespread resentment towards Western countries. The perceived unequal treaties and rejection of the racial equality clause at the end of World War I, along with subsequent racial discrimination against Japanese immigrants, fueled a desire to assert Japan's power and independence in the Pacific. Back in Europe, the relative peace of the 1920s was about to change. Mussolini's regime sought to recreate the glory of the Roman Empire through territorial expansion. This was a policy of spazio vitale, or living space. Italy aimed to avenge its previous defeat at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 and strengthen its position in East Africa by linking its existing colonies in Eritrea and Somaliland. A skirmish between Italian and Ethiopian forces at the Walwal Oasis in December 1934 provided Mussolini with a pretext for invasion. On October 3, 1935, Italian forces under General Emilio de Bono crossed from Eritrea into Ethiopia, facing little resistance and captured key towns. Mussolini intensified the campaign with modern military tactics, including tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons, violating international conventions, demonstrating the weakness of the League of Nations. Britain and France were weary from the last war, and were strained by administering former Ottoman and German territories, and did not intervene. By early 1936, Italian forces had advanced deep into Ethiopian territory, and on May 5 they entered the capital. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile, and Italy declared victory, annexing Ethiopia and integrating it into Italian East Africa along with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The occupation was marked by brutal reprisals and ongoing resistance from Ethiopian guerrilla fighters called the Arbegnok. In Germany, Hitler looked to the east and saw the greatest enemy to his Aryan master race. He saw millions of Slavs living on vast reaches of land. If he could conquer this land, Hitler envisioned establishing German settler colonies in the east, where ethnic Germans would live on large estates managed in a feudal-like system, maintained as an expanded Reich. The regions identified for expansion were primarily in Eastern Europe, particularly the vast, agriculturally rich lands of the Soviet Union. Poland and other Slavic countries were also targeted. Despite Hitler's power within his state, Germany itself remained weakened by the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. But Hitler took measures to dismantle it bit by bit. In October 1933, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference, rejecting the post-war international order. In March 1935, Hitler reintroduced conscription, openly defying the Treaty of Versailles. The size of the German army was expanded beyond the 100,000 troop limit. The Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, the Navy and Air Force, were rebuilt. In March 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, violating the treaty's demilitarization clause. The bold move alarmed France, but was met with little resistance from Britain, further emboldening Hitler. Britain was dealing with domestic issues of its own. After leading his country during the Great War, King George V, after a reign of over 25 years, was dead. He was succeeded by his son, who became Edward VIII. Edward's desire to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee with 2 living ex-husbands, led to a constitutional crisis. The British government, church, and public opinion were largely against the marriage. Edward had to choose between the marriage and the throne, and shockingly, he abdicated his position to marry Simpson, becoming the first British monarch to voluntarily relinquish the crown. His younger brother, Albert, ascended the throne as King George VI. Edward's later tour of Nazi Germany and photos with Hitler led to rumors that he was a Nazi sympathizer. King George's ascension helped stabilize the monarchy after the abdication crisis. He was seen as a modest and dedicated monarch, in stark contrast to his brother. The period saw Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister until 1937, followed by Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain's government is still particularly known for its policy of appeasement towards Hitler's Germany. This policy aimed to avoid war through diplomatic concessions, hoping for peace, or at least gain time in order to better rearm and prepare for a war. Hitler was quick to take advantage of this perceived weakness. The march west ended for now, as Hitler sought allies of his own, and he looked to annex his own homeland, Austria. After the dissolution of the empire after World War I, Austria was established as a republic. There remained deep divisions between Social Democrats and Conservatives. In 1932, Engelbert Dollfuss, of the Christian Social Party, became Chancellor, and after a brief civil war, the Social Democrats were suppressed and banned. Dollfuss then established the Federal State of Austria, a one-party, Austrofascist regime under the Fatherland Front. Austrofascists differed from the Nazis in that they promoted Austrian nationalism, Catholicism, and the preservation of Austrian independence in the face of the predominantly Protestant Germany. Unlike their Nazi neighbors, the Austrians were not concerned with racial ideology and fully aligned with the Catholic Church. But Austria had Nazis too, hoping to cede their independence to Germany. In July 1934, Dollfuss was assassinated during an attempted coup by these Austrian Nazis. The coup failed, but underscored their growing influence. Kurt Schuschnigg succeeded Dollfuss as Chancellor and continued Austrofascist policies, but faced increasing pressure from Nazi Germany. Mussolini, who sought to maintain Austria as an independent buffer state between Italy and Germany, initially opposed Hitler's moves to annex Austria. Mussolini initially viewed Hitler with some skepticism, but recognized the potential for a powerful alliance. Over time, Mussolini's stance softened, partly due to increasing international isolation and the realization that Italy and Germany could benefit from closer cooperation. The first demonstration of Germany and Italy's cooperative strength was in the aid of another authoritarian, in Spain. Spain had remained a monarchy until 1931, when it formed a republic. But it had been politically unstable and economically troubled for years, leading to deep polarization between left-wing factions advocating for reforms and right-wing groups seeking to maintain traditional structures. A military coup against the democratically elected Second Spanish Republic, led by General Francisco Franco and other nationalist officers, aimed to overthrow the leftist government. The coup's partial success resulted in a full-scale civil war between the Republicans, who supported the government, and the nationalists, who backed the coup. The conflict quickly drew international involvement, with the Republicans receiving limited support from the Soviet Union, but Britain and France, fearing a greater war, did not intervene. Many leftists from outside Spain came to help the Republicans, like the International Brigades, and foreign volunteers, including George Orwell, who went on to write Animal Farm and 1984. Both Hitler and Mussolini supported Francisco Franco's nationalist forces in the Spanish Civil War, further aligning their interests. Hitler and Mussolini provided troops, tanks, and aircraft, which played a crucial role in the nationalist advances. The Battle of Madrid, the Battle of Jarama, and the Battle of the Ebro saw intense fighting, with both sides committing atrocities against civilians. The bombing of Guernica by German and Italian aircraft became a symbol of the war's brutality. The Civil War was a perfect test for Hitler's new panzer tanks and Luftwaffe, But more than this, it showed Britain and France's reluctance to confront him. As the war progressed, leftist infighting and inexperience gave the nationalists the upper hand. Barcelona fell in January and Madrid in March, effectively ending the war. Francisco Franco declared victory on April 1, 1939, as the Republican government fled. Franco then established his own dictatorship and ruled Spain for nearly 40 years. Despite overtures from Germany and Italy for an alliance, the civil war had taken its toll, and Franco was focused on rebuilding and reliant on Western aid. On October 25, 1936, Italy and Germany made their alliance official with the Rome-Berlin Axis Agreement. The term Axis began as an informal alignment of ideology rather than an official alliance, describing the relationship between Rome and Berlin as the axis around which European politics would revolve. When Mussolini visited Germany a year later, he was thoroughly impressed by Nazi military parades and industrial output. Both nations would later enter a more formal alliance, called the Pact of Steel. Germany and Japan also entered an agreement pledging to oppose the spread of communism. Italy joined this pact as well, further solidifying the alliance between the three nations. By 1938, the Austrian Nazi Party, supported by Hitler, agitated for Anschluss, the joining of Germany and Austria. In an attempt to counter the growing Nazi influence, Schuschnigg announced a plebiscite on Austrian independence to be held on March 13, 1938. But, under immense pressure from Hitler, including threats of invasion, Schuschnigg cancelled the plebiscite and resigned on March 11. The next day, German troops marched into Austria without facing resistance, and many Austrians welcomed them. Austria was then officially annexed into Nazi Germany and renamed Ostmark. A new, Nazi-controlled plebiscite was held in April, overwhelmingly approving the Anschluss. The next target in Hitler's path was a country with a substantial German minority. Czechoslovakia had established itself as a parliamentary democracy with Tomáš Masaryk as its first president, becoming known for its democratic institutions and relatively progressive policies. The new country inherited a substantial amount of the former Austrian Empire's industrial base, particularly in the Czech lands. They also inherited its ethnic diversity, including a substantial minority of Germans living in the Sudetenland. The Sudeten German Party advocated for greater autonomy for the German minority and maintained close ties with Nazi Germany. In 1938, Hitler intensified his demands for the Sudetenland, leading to international pressure on Czechoslovakia from Britain and France, who sought to avoid another war. The Munich Conference, in late September, saw Britain, France, Germany, and Italy agree to allow Germany to annex the territory. Hitler promised this would be the end of his territorial ambitions. Czechoslovakia was excluded from the negotiations. Following the Munich Agreement, German troops occupied the Sudetenland in October 1938, seizing vital industrial and defensive infrastructure without military resistance. The remaining land was briefly reconstituted into a second republic, but the country's political and territorial integrity was severely weakened, and Slovak nationalist leaders sought to break away from Czechoslovakia. Hitler, now convinced of the weakness of the Western powers, went after even non-German territories. In March 1939, Nazi Germany invaded the Czech lands, partially annexing and occupying the regions as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Slovakia declared independence but was forced to ally with Nazi Germany as a client state. The Treaty of Versailles had established the Free City of Danzig as a semi-autonomous city-state under the protection of the League of Nations. It was not part of Germany or Poland, but was primarily inhabited by ethnic Germans who favored reunification with Germany. This was Hitler's next target. Poland was granted certain rights in the city, including the use of the port and control over the customs, as Danzig was an important economic hub for Polish trade. In 1939, Hitler intensified diplomatic pressure on Poland to allow the return of Danzig to Germany. He also demanded the construction of an extraterritorial highway and railway through the Polish corridor to connect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. Poland, backed by guarantees from Britain and France, refused Hitler's demands, recognizing that conceding to these demands would severely weaken its sovereignty and security. Despite an intense mutual lack of trust, England and France turned to the only power capable of preventing German hostility towards Poland: Stalin and the Soviet Union. But the Soviets were making deals of their own. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This pact cleared the way for Germany to act aggressively toward Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. And on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France could no longer stay silent. Days later, they declared war on Germany. The start of World War II. While these initial moves were occurring in Europe, in the East, conflict had begun much earlier. In seeking to address its economic woes and secure resources for its burgeoning population, Japan looked to the Asian mainland. The first significant move came in 1931 with the invasion of resource-rich Manchuria in northeastern China. The pretext for the invasion was the Mukden Incident, a staged event where Japanese soldiers blew up a section of the South Manchurian Railway and blamed Chinese dissidents. Using this fabricated excuse, the Japanese Kwantung Army swiftly occupied Manchuria, facing minimal resistance. By 1932, Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing the last Qing emperor, Puyi, as its figurehead ruler. This move was met with international condemnation, particularly from the League of Nations, which deemed Japan's actions illegal. But Japan simply withdrew from the League in 1933, signaling its commitment to an expansionist agenda. Meanwhile, within the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT nationalists were too preoccupied with the communist threat to deal with Japanese encroachment. Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by Chinese warlords in 1936 and convinced to instead negotiate with the communists in order to deal with the more pressing Japanese threat. Once again, the nationalists and communists formed a united front against a common foe. In 1937, tensions between Japan and China escalated at the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing and erupted into a massive invasion of China and the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese moved quickly, capturing the old capital of Beijing. One of the earliest and most significant battles was the Battle of Shanghai, where fierce urban combat resulted in heavy casualties before the city fell to the Japanese. The fall of Nanjing in December 1937, the capital, led to the infamous Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese troops committed widespread atrocities, including mass executions and sexual violence, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers. Despite initial Japanese victories, the war soon became a protracted and grueling conflict. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government retreated to the interior, establishing a new capital in Chongqing and continuing to resist. Meanwhile, Mao and the communist armies mobilized local populations and conducted guerrilla raids against Japanese forces. Japan's aggressive expansionism continued into the early 1940s. They sought to create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a concept promoting Japanese leadership over a bloc of Asian nations free from Western influence. This vision involved not only the conquest of China, but also the annexation of Southeast Asian territories rich in natural resources such as rubber and tin from Malaya, and oil from the Dutch East Indies. But this region was still under the influence of European and American powers. Would Japan be up to the challenge? In Europe, Germany was on the march. Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 involved a combination of rapid, coordinated air and ground assaults. This was the Blitzkrieg strategy, or lightning war. German forces attacked from multiple directions, from the north, East Prussia, the west, Germany, and the south, Slovakia, which had allied with Germany. This multi-pronged assault overwhelmed Polish defenses. In the east, in accordance with their pact with the Germans, the Soviet Union took control of their own sphere of influence. Apart from eastern Poland, the Soviet Union launched a large-scale invasion of Finland in November, the start of the Winter War. Despite the overwhelming size of the Soviet force, Finnish troops utilized their knowledge of the terrain and the harsh winter conditions to employ effective guerrilla tactics and defensive strategies, notably on the fortified Mannerheim line. The Finnish forces, under the leadership of Field Marshal Gustav Mannerheim, managed to achieve significant victories against Soviet forces sometimes up to 5 times as large. The Soviets, initially unprepared for the severe winter with temperatures reaching -43 degrees Celsius, faced logistical challenges and low morale. But by February, they had reorganized and reinforced their troops, launching a renewed offensive that eventually breached the Finnish defenses on the Karelian Isthmus. Facing the threat of total occupation, Finland entered into peace negotiations. Finland had to cede approximately 11% of its territory, but it maintained its independence. By 1940, the Soviets had moved into the Baltic states and eastern Romania, and suffered no pushback from the Germans due to their pact. On April 9, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark capitulated almost immediately, offering minimal resistance. The invasion of Norway was more challenging, involving fierce fighting between German forces and Norwegian, British, and French troops. Despite the Allied attempts to defend Norway, Germany succeeded in occupying key ports and cities by June 1940. Sweden remained neutral during the war, but allowed the transit of German troops through Swedish territory to Norway, as well as continuing trade with Germany, including the export of crucial iron ore, which was vital for the German war industry. But they also aided and negotiated with the Allies, playing a delicate balancing act. In May, Germany finally looked west to take care of France and Britain. As France had built the defensive Maginot Line, the Germans bypassed it by attacking from the Low Countries. The British and French, expecting a repeat of the First World War, once again dug trenches and once again prepared for the menace of gas attacks. But the time of static war was long dead. Lightning war was the order of the day. On the day of the invasion, May 10th, Luxembourg fell quickly, while German paratroopers and ground units overwhelmed the Dutch defenses, and they surrendered soon after the bombing of Rotterdam. This drew in the British and French forces to take up a defensive position on the River Dyle in Belgium. But while the Allies were engaged there, the main German thrust, Army Group A, targeted another area entirely, the lightly guarded Ardennes region. It was hilly and heavily forested. The French never thought heavily armored units could make it through quickly. But for the Germans, it bypassed both the Maginot Line to the south and the Allies to the north. Army Group A then broke through the French lines and executed a rapid advance westward toward the English Channel. This effectively cut off the Allied armies from the rest of France. With the Allied forces trapped, the British government executed a plan to evacuate the British, French, and Belgian soldiers from the port of Dunkirk. Though over 300,000 soldiers were successfully evacuated, it was a hasty affair and most equipment was left behind for German hands. After the Dunkirk evacuation, the Germans shifted their focus southward. The French army, demoralized and disorganized, was unable to mount a significant defense against the advancing German forces. The French government declared Paris an open city to avoid its destruction, and German forces entered Paris on June 14 without resistance. In just 3 days, France sought an armistice. At Hitler's insistence, it was signed in Compiègne, in the same railway carriage where the 1918 armistice had been signed. The country was divided into a German-occupied zone in the north and the Vichy regime, a puppet authoritarian government in the south, led by French World War I hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain. Pétain's government dismantled the democratic institutions of the French Third Republic and established an authoritarian regime. Pétain assumed extensive powers and promoted a conservative, nationalistic agenda under the slogan Work, Family, Fatherland. In less than a year, the swift blitzkrieg attacks gave Hitler control of both Central and Western Europe. Now all that stood between Hitler and victory was the lonely island of Britain. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in May, succeeding Neville Chamberlain, who had lost the confidence of Parliament due to his handling of the war. An amphibious invasion was planned, Operation Sea Lion. In preparation for the assault, the Luftwaffe targeted shipping convoys and ports in the Channel, attempting to lure out the Royal Air Force. But the RAF maintained its defensive posture, avoiding heavy losses. The Germans shifted to a new phase, called Eagle Attack, intensifying bombings on RAF airfields and communications networks. Despite significant damage to airfields, the RAF, under Hugh Dowding, managed to keep most of its airfields operational and continued to defend effectively, thanks to the resilience of its pilots, ground crews, and the use of a new early warning device. This was Chain Home, a coastal radar system. To mislead the Germans and others about the effectiveness of their radar network, the British circulated alternative explanations for their success. One such story was that British pilots were consuming large quantities of carrots to improve their night vision, diverting attention from the role of radar in detecting enemy aircraft. The myth about eating carrots to help your vision persisted well after the war. Despite this, the RAF was stretched thin and was at its breaking point. Goering ordered his bombers to begin night raids as well, to put the nail in the coffin. But on a night in mid-August, a group of bombers went wayward and hit London, the first strike on a non-military target. The RAF hit back soon after, striking Berlin. In a rage, Hitler ordered further attacks on London and other cities. The Blitz on London began in early September, targeting both civilian areas and industrial sites, hoping to break civilian morale. But all it did was give the weary RAF crucial time to recuperate. By October 1940, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The Battle of Britain would die down, and the focus of operations shifted to nightly bombing raids, continuing the Blitz on London and other cities. Though tens of thousands of civilians were killed and millions of residences destroyed, British morale did not break as Hitler had hoped. By May 1941, the Luftwaffe had largely abandoned its campaign against Britain as they prepared for another invasion in the east. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat for Hitler's military forces, demonstrating that Germany could be resisted. More than this, it ensured that Britain remained a base for future Allied operations in Europe. But Britain knew it couldn't hold on to Europe alone. And there was just one country left that could make the difference. The United States had made a miraculous turnaround after the Great Depression, thanks to the efforts of President Roosevelt, who had just been re-elected for a third term. He and Churchill had written correspondence and became friends over their shared experiences in their respective navies. Though the American public remained firm in their neutrality, the government shipped supplies to Britain over the Atlantic. By May 1941, under the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt was supplying Britain, China, and later other Allied nations with food, oil, and military equipment at no charge. But this became quite dangerous, as the Germans used U-boats to create a blockade around the Isles to starve Britain into submission. Though the Germans were instructed not to target American ships, some were struck accidentally. Lucky for Hitler, public opinion in the United States still preferred neutrality. For now. Mussolini and the Italians aimed to expand their influence elsewhere, in the Mediterranean, Africa, and the Balkans. The Mediterranean had been dominated by Britain as a gateway to the Suez Canal and their territories in Asia. But Mussolini's claims of Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea, meant the British had to be driven out. Italy needed to keep their supply lines to Libya, while the British needed theirs to Egypt. Initial skirmishes remained inconclusive, but that soon changed after a night in November 1940. The British launched an air raid at Taranto, severely crippling several Italian battleships and weakening Mussolini's naval power. In March, at the Battle of Cape Matapan off the coast of Greece, the Royal Navy sunk several more ships, and the Italian Navy would cease to be a problem. But Hitler decided to send men to aid the Italians. They had unsuccessfully been trying to capture the island of Malta, a British colony and key to controlling the central Mediterranean. The island endured intense bombing by the German and Italian air forces, but despite being heavily damaged, it held out due to resupply efforts and the resilience of its defenders. It remained a vital base for disrupting Axis supply lines to North Africa. This was crucial, as the Italians had opened a new campaign in the region. In September 1940, Italian forces launched an invasion into Egypt, hoping to seize the British-controlled Suez Canal. They made it to Sidi Barrani, a small coastal town. In December, the British launched Operation Compass, a counter-offensive to push back the Italians. Commanded by General Richard O'Connor, British and Commonwealth forces swiftly defeated the Italians, capturing key positions like Bardia and Tobruk. By February 1941, the British had advanced deep into Libya, taking Benghazi and capturing tens of thousands of Italian troops. To support the faltering Italian forces, Hitler sent the Afrika Korps, led by General Erwin Rommel, to North Africa in February. Rommel quickly regained the initiative, launching a series of counterattacks and retaking much of the territory lost to the British. As the British were driven back to the border of Egypt, the Afrika Korps cut off an Australian-led garrison in the Libyan port of Tobruk. Rommel laid siege to the city, as the garrison took up defensive positions underground and in caves, earning them the moniker of the Rats of Tobruk. It came to be taken as a badge of pride. They held out for over 7 months, before being relieved by the British. In the East African campaign, Italian forces initially gained ground, but a determined Allied counteroffensive, including troops from South Africa, India, and East African colonies, recaptured key territories in Eritrea and Ethiopia, leading to the restoration of Emperor Haile Selassie. The Italians also initiated attacks in the Balkans. They had already annexed Albania in 1939, and in October 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from his puppet state. The invasion quickly stalled, and the Greek army mounted a successful counteroffensive, pushing the Italians back into Albania. Frustrated by Italy's failure and concerned about the strategic implications, Hitler decided to intervene. Yugoslavia had initially attempted to remain neutral, but a coup in March brought a pro-British government to power. In response, Germany, along with Italian and Hungarian forces, invaded Yugoslavia and quickly dismembered the country, partitioning it among the Axis powers and their allies. Following the invasion of Yugoslavia, German forces turned their attention to Greece. Despite fierce resistance from Greek and British Commonwealth forces, Athens also fell. Crete was invaded in May through a massive airborne assault, and the region was secured for the Axis. Now, the Germans turned their focus back to the east to fulfill Hitler's ultimate goal of the destruction of the Soviet Union. He aimed to conquer vast territories in the east to secure land and resources for the German people. Despite still being allies on paper, the Führer viewed the Soviet Union as a bastion of Judeo-Bolshevism and a major ideological enemy, believing that the destruction of the Soviet state would eliminate the threat of communism and solidify Nazi dominance in Europe. This operation was originally named Operation Otto, after the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But Hitler praised yet another. According to legend, Frederick Barbarossa, one of the great leaders of medieval Europe, did not die on his journey to the Crusades, but was instead sleeping in a hidden cavern and would one day awaken to restore Germany to greatness. Hitler invoked the legend and symbolism associated with the emperor to inspire and legitimize his grand plan. So the invasion was named after him. Operation Barbarossa aimed for a rapid and decisive victory. The Red Army was bigger, and a prolonged war would only make things harder for the Germans. Though scheduled for the spring, the operation had to be postponed because of the troubles in the Balkans. But Hitler had no doubts the giant would fall as long as they were hit quickly. Over its course, Operation Barbarossa saw the deployment of around 3.8 million military personnel and over 3,000 tanks and aircraft. It was to be the largest invasion force in history. The Luftwaffe began with extensive bombing raids on Soviet airfields, destroying much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground and providing air superiority for all advancing units. The invasion was divided into three main thrusts. Army Group South moved towards Ukraine, aiming to capture Kiev and secure the rich agricultural and industrial regions. Army Group North advanced towards Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, to capture the city and secure the northern flank. An Army Group Center targeted Moscow, aiming for a quick and decisive blow to the Soviet leadership and infrastructure. The initial stages of the invasion saw rapid advances by German forces using blitzkrieg tactics to encircle and destroy large Soviet formations. The Luftwaffe attacked simultaneously and quickly dominated the skies. Stalin responded by issuing a scorched earth policy, instructing Soviets and farmers to destroy any infrastructure or resources that could be useful to the Germans, as well as calling for total mobilization for the war effort. Key cities such as Minsk and Smolensk were captured by Army Group Center, setting them up to march on Moscow. But instead of continuing towards the capital, Hitler ordered them to aid Army Group South in Ukraine first. In Ukraine, German armies were greeted as liberators, freed from Soviet oppression. Army Group South then continued towards the Crimean Peninsula and laid siege to Sevastopol, aided by their massive 80-centimeter railway gun, the Heavy Gustav. Within a few months, Crimea too was theirs. In the meantime, Army Group North had reached Leningrad. The siege was one of the longest and most devastating in history, enduring for 872 days. The city faced severe shortages of food and fuel. There was immense suffering and deaths of an estimated 1 million civilians from starvation, exposure, and shelling. Despite the dire conditions, Leningrad's defenders and residents showed remarkable resilience, maintaining the city's defense against German and Finnish fighters. By October 1941, Army Group Center was closing in on Moscow, but logistical issues stretched supply lines thin. The autumn rains caused what the Russians called Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. Relying on a swift advance, the Germans were sucked into a muddy quagmire. And it delayed their advance, just enough for another Soviet ally to come to their aid. Winter had come early. Transport vehicles stalled in freezing temperatures, and some officers wanted to wait until spring to resume the attack. But in December, the Soviets received reinforcements primarily consisting of well-trained and well-equipped divisions from the Soviet Far East and Siberia. They launched a major counter-offensive, pushing the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow, and the advance was halted. But the question remained whether this was enough to win the Eastern Front. Perhaps Hitler needed more allies. By mid-1941, Hitler was already allied with Italy and a number of Balkan states, but the most consequential ally came from the Far East. In 1940, the Empire of Japan joined the Axis powers through the Tripartite Pact. This alliance further emboldened Japan's militaristic ambitions in the Pacific. The same year, they occupied northern French Indochina to cut off supplies to Chinese forces. This move alarmed the United States and other Western powers, as it signaled Japan's intent for domination. In 1941, Japan's expansion reached a critical juncture. The US imposed economic sanctions and an oil embargo, aiming to curb its aggression. Facing a crippling shortage of resources, Japanese leaders decided to strike against Western colonial powers in Southeast Asia and the Pacific to secure the necessary supplies. This was done under the guise of liberating Southeast Asia from Western imperialism. Japan planned a quick strike, hoping to eliminate American presence and force them to acknowledge Japanese hegemony in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan struck, launching a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was planned for 8 a.m. on a Sunday, just as the Americans were either relaxing or enjoying the sun. But soon, that same sun turned blood red. Waves of Japanese aircraft, including bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, descended upon the unsuspecting base. Within the span of 2 hours, they unleashed devastating blows on American battleships, destroyers, and aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, including a small number of civilians. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into World War II. Soon after the U.S. declaration of war on Japan, Hitler, claiming Roosevelt was controlled by the Eternal Jew, declared war on the United States. By the end of 1941, Britain was alone no longer, but united with the Soviet Union and United States as the Allies. But still on the front foot, a series of rapid Japanese conquests across the Pacific followed. They soon seized Hong Kong, the Philippines, British Burma and Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous Pacific islands, establishing a vast empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to New Guinea in the south. American General Douglas MacArthur, stationed in the Philippines, was ordered to evacuate, but he vowed to return. In Japan, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo celebrated, as the emperor looked on. But their attack on the US Pacific Fleet wasn't as crippling as they had hoped. Ships were bombed or sunk in the shallow waters of the harbor and were retrievable. And their aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were all absent during the attack and remained unscathed. Soon, the stars, once scattered and distant, would converge to eclipse the sun. Over the course of the war, the German home front was marked by extensive mobilization in an increasingly oppressive regime. But Hitler knew domestic morale was paramount if he was to avoid the mistakes of the First World War. He relied on his blitzkrieg strategy to strike quickly, so less ammunition needed to be produced. This kept production of consumer goods high. Once he occupied a new territory, he would use those materials instead of those from the home front. As the war continued, Hitler continued to build his Nazi New Order, his vision for a restructured Europe under the dominance of Nazi Germany, built on a foundation of racial hierarchy and totalitarian control. His concept of Lebensraum, or living space, was coming together as Germany had now acquired vast territories in Eastern Europe to provide land and resources for the German population. The General Plan Ost, a secret Nazi plan, detailed the resettlement of millions of Germans in these conquered territories, with the ultimate goal of Germanizing the region and securing its resources. The new order also involved the extensive use of foreign labor to support the German war effort and economy. Millions of civilians from occupied countries were forcibly conscripted into labor, working in harsh and often brutal conditions in German industries, farms, and infrastructure projects. These foreign workers were essential to maintaining Germany's production levels, while the German men were fighting on the front lines. In Eastern Europe, the Nazi occupation was particularly brutal. The implementation of General Plan Ost involved mass expulsions, executions, and the destruction of entire communities to make way for German settlers. The Hunger Plan aimed to starve millions of Slavs by redirecting food supplies to Germany, causing widespread famine and suffering. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the German army's advance eastward, conducting mass shootings of Jews, communists, and other targeted groups. Jews were rounded up and forced to live in urban ghettos in the major cities until they could figure out how to be dealt with. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the Germans formalized the final solution, the plan to systematically annihilate the Jewish population of Europe. Heinrich Himmler, commander of the SS, thought bullets became too costly and too slow to use. So they turned to gas. This was part of one of the most horrific aspects of the Nazi New Order, the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other minority groups deemed undesirable by the regime. 6 extermination camps were set up in Poland, alongside work camps, where Jews from all over Europe were sent. Men went to the work camps and worked to death, while the old, the women, and children straight to the gas chambers. Despite the severe repression, an active resistance movement emerged in Poland. The Home Army was the largest resistance organization, conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla warfare against the Germans. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in November 1940. It was one of the largest ghettos in Nazi-occupied Europe, with more than 400,000 Jews crammed into a small area of the city. Many residents were deported to extermination camps. In response to the mass deportations and the horrific conditions, resistance groups formed within the ghetto. The two primary groups were the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union. Their most significant act of resistance occurred in April 1943, the day before the Jewish holiday of Passover, as the Germans launched a final operation to liquidate the ghetto. Jewish fighters launched a coordinated attack against the German forces using homemade weapons, smuggled firearms, and Molotov cocktails. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the Jewish fighters employed guerrilla tactics, utilized the ghetto's underground bunkers and tunnels. The German forces responded with overwhelming force, systematically destroying buildings, and set the ghetto on fire. The uprising officially ended after a month, on May 16, when the Germans declared victory and blew up the Great Synagogue of Warsaw as a symbolic act. By this time, much of the ghetto was in ruins, and the remaining fighters and residents were either killed or captured. The Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia was brutal in its own right. Japan aimed to extract the region's rich natural resources, like rubber, oil, and rice, to support its war effort. This involved reorganizing occupied territories for maximum production and forcing millions of locals into labor. Politically, Japan established military governments to enforce strict control, replacing colonial administrations and promoting the idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere to gain local support. Culturally, Japan attempted to impose its language and traditions, using schools and media for propaganda while suppressing local customs. The occupation saw numerous Japanese war crimes and atrocities, including massacres, summary executions, and the forced conscription of women as comfort women for Japanese troops. Forced labor on the Burma-Thailand Railway resulted in tens of thousands of deaths due to malnutrition, disease, and mistreatment. Despite these harsh conditions, resistance movements emerged across Southeast Asia, engaging in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and covert operations. In the Philippines, the Hukbalahap guerrillas fought against the Japanese, while in Malaya, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army played a significant role. Resistance movements often united diverse ethnic and political groups, such as the cooperation between communist and nationalist factions in the Vietnamese resistance led by the Viet Minh. Initially, Japan's early victories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific bolstered national confidence. The government, led by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, employed extensive propaganda to foster a sense of unity and purpose among the populace. The government instituted strict rationing of food, fuel, and other essentials to support the military, and the public was encouraged to conserve resources and contribute to war efforts through campaigns such as metal collection drives. In the Soviet Union, the battle on the home front was known as the Great Patriotic War. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union suffered significant territorial losses and mass evacuations, with millions of citizens and key industrial enterprises relocated to the east. This led to the centralization of the Soviet war economy, overseen by the State Defense Committee, which redirected all resources toward military production. Factories were dismantled and reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains, ensuring continued production despite the proximity of the front lines. During the war, industrial output increased remarkably under the Soviet labor force, which included women, children, and the elderly. Despite these efforts, Soviet civilians faced severe rationing and scarcity of food, clothing, and essential supplies. Housing and infrastructure were destroyed by bombing raids and battles, forcing many to live in inadequate and overcrowded conditions. To maintain morale and foster a sense of patriotism, the Soviet government launched extensive propaganda campaigns. Posters, films, radio broadcasts, and newspapers highlighted Soviet heroism and unity against the fascist invaders. The Stakhanovite movement was promoted to encourage extraordinary productivity among workers, while cultural mobilization saw writers, artists, and musicians contributing to the war effort through their work. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which prompted the U.S. entry into the war, the nation swiftly transformed its economy to meet the demands of a global conflict. The federal government played a crucial role in directing the war effort. Agencies such as the War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization coordinated the conversion of peacetime industries to wartime production. This shift led to an unprecedented increase in industrial output, with the U.S. producing more war materials than any other Allied nation. The labor force expanded to meet the demands of wartime production. Millions of men enlisted in the armed forces, leading to labor shortages that were filled by women and minority workers. Over 1 million Black Americans and other minorities left the rural South to industrial cities in the North, although they continued to face discrimination and segregation. The Double V campaign sought victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, highlighting the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Women too entered the workforce in large numbers, taking on roles in factories, shipyards, and offices. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter symbolized the vital contributions of female workers. The government introduced rationing programs for food, gasoline, rubber, and other essential materials to ensure that enough resources were available for the military. Victory Gardens were promoted as patriotic duties, while scrap drives supplemented the supply of materials. War bonds were sold to finance the war effort, and propaganda campaigns encouraged Americans to invest in these bonds to support the troops. In the west of the country, over 100,000 Japanese Americans, the majority born in the United States, were imprisoned in what were called internment camps, despite the loyalty of many Japanese Americans to the United States. This policy, driven by wartime hysteria, remains a dark chapter in U.S. history. Though the claims were that the Japanese could have been working for the Axis, Italian and German Americans were not given the same treatment. The rationale was that it was simply easier to trust those of Italian or German heritage. But America did have Nazi sympathizers. The Bund was a pro-Nazi organization founded in 1936, promoting Nazi ideology, including anti-Semitism, and supported Adolf Hitler's regime in Germany. One of their most infamous events was a rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City on February 20, 1939, which attracted around 20,000 participants and featured anti-Semitic speeches and propaganda. Following the United States' entry into the war, the U.S. government cracked down on the Bund, and it went into decline. In the realm of science and technology, a letter from physicists Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard to President Roosevelt, warned about the potential for Germany to develop a devastating new weapon. In response, the Manhattan Project, a top-secret initiative, was formally established in 1942 and brought together some of the greatest scientific minds. And the result would be nuclear. Though the Americans entered the war, it was not as desperate a situation as in 1917, and victory for Germany was still very much in the cards. Though it looked dire for the Allies, they finally brought about a series of crucial victories which shifted the momentum of the war. By mid-1943, the Allies had gained the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic, as sustained Allied offensives against U-boat bases and production facilities further weakened the German submarine fleet. In the North African campaign, neither side could overpower the other. An exasperated Churchill then visited Egypt and gave regional command to Harold Alexander and command of the Eighth Army to General Bernard Montgomery. A few months later, in October, the British and Germans clashed once more at El Alamein. This time, the Allies were aided by the arrival of new Sherman tanks sent from the United States. Montgomery then chased Rommel through Libya as the German commander retreated to Tunisia. This was the Allies' first major victory that broke the stalemate, marking a turning point in North Africa. Following this, the first mass of American troops entered the war. Their first mission was Operation Torch. This was a major Allied amphibious assault involving landings in French North Africa in early to mid-November. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed as the supreme commander of the Allied forces for the operation. Though French North Africa was nominally under control of the Vichy regime, the soldiers, including many Moroccans and Algerians, fought alongside the Allies. The successful landings, combined with subsequent advances, trapped Axis forces in a pincer movement between the Allied forces advancing from the west and the British Eighth Army pushing from the east, leading to the eventual surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943, thereby ending the North African campaign. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Hitler shifted focus to the south, sending an army to secure the oil fields of the Caucasus and another to capture Stalingrad, an important industrial city housing factories that produced military equipment. Stalingrad was also a key position to secure the northern flank of the advancing German armies moving towards the Caucasus. From August 23, 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad was one of the deadliest and most crucial battles of the war. It quickly devolved into intense urban warfare, with Soviet forces employing a strategy of close-quarters combat to counter the Germans' superior firepower. But the Germans captured key positions in the city and reached the Volga. The Volga River was essential for moving oil from the Caucasus to other parts of the Soviet Union. Despite severe losses, the Soviets managed to keep pockets of resistance within the city, while Soviet General Zhukov amassed an army on the other side of the Volga. The turning point came with a massive Soviet counteroffensive launched in November 1942, which aimed to encircle the German army by attacking the weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces on the flanks. This successful maneuver trapped General Paulus and approximately 300,000 German and Axis troops inside Stalingrad. The encircled German forces were ordered by Hitler to hold their ground. But in the face of harsh winter conditions, dwindling supplies, and relentless Soviet attacks, the situation had become desperate. General Paulus surrendered on January 31st, and the remaining German forces capitulated on February 2nd. The Battle of Stalingrad is sometimes regarded as the deadliest battle in all human history, with estimates of up to 3 million casualties total. This defeat marked the first major loss for the German army and significantly weakened their forces on the Eastern Front. This momentum was further solidified by the Battle of Kursk in July and August 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets relied on their T-34s, the backbone of their armored forces. But the Germans upgraded their own Panzer tanks, introducing the Panther, a counter to the Soviet tanks, and the Tiger I, capable of destroying any Allied tank at long range. But despite the extensive firepower, this battle would not be won through strength, but intelligence. The British had shared decrypted German Enigma codes with the Soviets, and they were well aware of the German plans. The Red Army constructed extensive defensive lines, including multiple layers of minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, trenches, and fortified bunkers. After withstanding the German assault, the Soviet counteroffensive established air superiority and picked off the German tanks. The Soviet victory at Kursk thwarted the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan sought to eliminate the United States as a strategic power in the Pacific, thereby securing its dominance in the region. The Japanese aimed to lure American aircraft carriers into a trap and destroy them, thereby solidifying their control over the Pacific. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes and were aware of the planned attack on the island of Midway, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to prepare an ambush. The battle primarily involved aircraft launched from carriers. The U.S. had 3 against Japan's 4. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft bombarded Midway Island, but American planes launched from their carriers found and attacked the Japanese fleet. American dive bombers, in a series of well-coordinated strikes, managed to hit and sink 3 Japanese carriers in quick succession. The 4th carrier was later found and destroyed. Japanese pilots ran out of fuel, and only the ocean was there to greet them. The Battle of Midway was a decisive victory for the United States. The Japanese carrier fleet was depleted, and Japanese expansion in the Pacific was halted, shifting the balance of naval power to the Allies. This was Japan's first major defeat, and stalled their expansion. The Allies, primarily made up of U.S. Marines, then went on the offensive. Their first target was Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, where a Japanese airbase posed a direct threat to the U.S., Australia, and New Zealand. The Marines landed on August 7, 1942, capturing the airfield that was still under construction. Control of the airfield was fiercely contested, with several major battles and repeated Japanese offensives to retake it. Both sides faced challenges in maintaining supply lines and reinforcing their troops. Both sides also had to deal with crippling disease. But the Allies, with better logistics and air superiority, gradually gained the upper hand. The successful Allied campaign at Guadalcanal marked the beginning of a series of offensive operations that pushed Japanese forces back across the Pacific. The Battle of Midway and the Guadalcanal campaign were critical turning points in the Pacific War. The Tehran Conference, held from November 28 to December 1, 1943, was the first major meeting between the big 3 Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. It took place in the Iranian capital and focused on coordinating the military strategy against the Axis powers. The primary military objective was to plan the opening of a second front in Western Europe, which led to the agreement on Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Additionally, the leaders discussed the future of Eastern Europe, with Stalin emphasizing Soviet security concerns and seeking recognition of Soviet influence in the region, particularly Poland. The conference also laid the groundwork to establish an international organization to replace the failed League of Nations and maintain peace and security after the war. Following the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, the Allies turned their attention to Italy. There were 2 major routes to invasion, either through Sardinia or through Sicily. The Allies decided to go up through Sicily. They tricked the Germans, dumping the corpse of a homeless man off the shore, disguised as a Royal Marines officer, with papers claiming the invasion would instead be through Sardinia, but that the Allies would fake an attack on Sicily. The invasion of Sicily itself, codenamed Operation Husky, began in July. Because of the deception, the island was easily captured by the next month, opening the Mediterranean for Allied shipping and paving the way for the invasion of mainland Italy. The fall of Sicily led to a crisis in Italy. Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested. Marshal Pietro Badoglio assumed power and began secret negotiations with the Allies. In September, the British Eighth Army, under General Montgomery, crossed the Strait of Messina and landed in Calabria, followed by the main landings at Salerno in September. Italy officially surrendered to the Allies, but German forces quickly moved to disarm Italian troops and take control of key positions, continuing the fight against the Allies. Despite fierce German resistance, reinforcements and naval gunfire support helped secure the beachhead. Concurrent with the Salerno landings, British forces conducted Operation Slapstick, landing at the port of Taranto in southern Italy and encountering little resistance. The German defensive line, known as the Gustav Line, ran across Italy and included the stronghold at Monte Cassino. The Allies launched several assaults on Monte Cassino between January and May 1944, facing intense German resistance. The town and the historic Benedictine monastery were heavily bombed and destroyed during the battle, but in May, Polish and other Allied troops succeeded in capturing the hilltop, breaking through the Gustav Line. Concurrently, to bypass the Gustav Line, the Allies conducted an amphibious landing at Anzio, just south of Rome, on January 22. Initially, the landings were successful, but the subsequent advance stalled as German forces launched strong counterattacks, leading to a protracted and bloody struggle. The Allies eventually broke out of the Anzio beachhead in May. Following the breakthrough at Monte Cassino and Anzio, Allied forces advanced towards Rome, which was liberated on June 4, 1944. After the fall of Rome, the Allies continued their advance northward, encountering strong German defensive positions along the Gothic Line. Despite harsh conditions and fierce resistance, they pushed through and captured Florence and Bologna. By 1945, the Allies had achieved victory in Italy. Mussolini was shot and killed by Italian partisans, and his corpse strung upside down in Milan. In planning for the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, the Western Allies, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, developed a strategy to open a Western front to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union and push towards Germany. Churchill and Roosevelt met and agreed on a time and place. The code name for the operation would be Overlord. It would eventually be set for summer 1944. The Germans had built a series of fortifications along the shoreline, covering the beaches with mines, barbed wire, and artillery. Hitler had anticipated an invasion on the European mainland, but could do little without knowing where or when. The Allies settled on one of two locations. The shortest distance from Britain, Pas-de-Calais, or the beaches of Normandy. As Pas-de-Calais was the most obvious choice, Normandy was chosen as the invasion point. The British came up with ingenious devices to swiftly break through the German fortifications, including machines to destroy mines and barbed wire, create firm pathing, clearing ditches, and building makeshift bridges. To deceive the Germans, the Allies built up a completely fake army unit in Kent, just across from Pas-de-Calais, part of a deceptive planning operation called Bodyguard. American Dwight Eisenhower was given the supreme command of the Allied forces for the invasion. After a short postponement, the first Allied planes flew over Normandy on June 6, 1944. Soon, Allied ships emerged from the night mists as well. Around 156,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Despite rough weather and fierce resistance, particularly at Omaha Beach, the Allies established beachheads and began their advance inland. By the end of June, over 850,000 had landed at Normandy. In desperation, Hitler struck back by attacking civilian sites in Britain with a new weapon. This was the first of a new series of cruise missiles, fittingly called Vengeance. The first of these was a flying bomb called the Vengeance Weapon 1, or V1. They had to be fired from the shorelines in northern France, buzzing into London and exploding in unpredictable locations. Situated on the shorelines, these were soon dismantled after the Allied invasion. But on the heels of the V1 was the much more potent V2, capable of reaching Britain from much further away. These remained a problem until the Allies pushed the German lines back enough until they were out of range. That summer, the Americans head west to secure Cherbourg. In the meantime, British and Canadians launched a series of operations to capture the city of Caen. Though the British were repeatedly repelled, they eventually took the city by the end of July, but stiff German resistance meant they couldn't continue any further. Luckily, the intense battle served as a distraction and allowed American troops to execute their breakout in the west, Operation Cobra. Soon, the Americans fanned out and encircled the Germans in a pocket near the town of Falaise. An estimated 10,000 German soldiers were killed and 40,000 to 50,000 captured. And the Allies had won Normandy. In the meantime, in southern France, another landing was conducted, Operation Dragoon. The operation began with an amphibious assault on the French Riviera. The landings involved a combined force of American, Free French, and British troops, supported by naval and air bombardments. The German forces in the region were caught off guard and quickly overwhelmed. The Allies encountered relatively light resistance, enabling a rapid advance inland. Marseille and Toulon were liberated by the end of August, with French forces playing a significant role in these operations. By summer 1944, the Allies in the north reached Paris. German forces in the city had their hands busy with the French resistance, and Paris was liberated quickly, as the Germans disobeyed Hitler's orders and surrendered. The liberation of France paved the way for the establishment of the Provisional Government of the French Republic, led by General Charles de Gaulle. It restored French sovereignty and laid the foundation for post-war reconstruction and the Fourth Republic. The elderly Philippe Pétain, hero of the First World War who turned Nazi collaborationist, was tried for treason and spent the rest of his days imprisoned. Back in the East, the German sense of inevitable victory had eroded. After Stalingrad, Hitler wasn't the same, and some even noticed differences in his appearance, due to a stark decline in both physical and mental health. Some even believed he had been replaced with a look-alike. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, documented many of Hitler's symptoms, which were seemingly consistent with Parkinson's disease. Morell prescribed dozens of medication to Hitler throughout the war, including methamphetamine, barbiturates, opiates, and cocaine eye drops. Joseph Goebbels' declaration of total war called for the full mobilization of all resources and the population to support the war effort. Under Albert Speer's direction, Germany's war production peaked, despite the growing strain from Allied bombing campaigns. From 1943 onwards, the Allied strategic bombing campaigns brought severe destruction to German cities, leading to significant civilian casualties and displacement. Cities like Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden were targeted to disrupt industrial production, transportation networks, and civilian morale. Though the Germans updated their radar networks during the war, the bombers launched bursts of aluminum strips to jam their radar. But it wasn't long before the Germans countered it, and there was stalemate once more. American bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, were more accurate than the British night bombers, so preferred to attack strategic German infrastructure. But the British, with less accurate bombers, resorted to a strategy of carpet bombing. Both the British and Americans conducted a particularly devastating bombing at Dresden that winter. Over 1,200 bombers dropped incendiary bombs that created a firestorm, destroying much of the city and killing an estimated 25,000 to 35,000 people. The bombings left German cities in ruins and displaced millions. But for all the death, nothing was accomplished, and it gave the Germans a new rallying call against the enemy. But not everyone stood by the Führer. Many high-ranking officers in the German military, including members of the General Staff, were disillusioned with his leadership. They believed that his refusal to listen to military advice and his insistence on holding untenable positions were leading Germany to ruin. They believed that removing Hitler was necessary to restore Germany's honor. On July 20, 1944, during a meeting at the Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia, Klaus von Stauffenberg, an army officer, placed a bomb in a briefcase near Hitler. The bomb exploded, but due to a heavy oak table, Hitler was shielded from the full force of the blast. He survived with minor injuries. Not only was the Führer still alive, he used the event to justify purges and tighten his grip on the military and government. Rommel, the Desert Fox, became implicated and forced to commit suicide. Meanwhile, Allied forces liberated much of Belgium and Luxembourg in the late summer and fall of 1944. But the liberation of Western Europe continued with Operation Market Garden in September, an ambitious plan to capture bridges in the Netherlands and create a pathway into Germany from the north, bypassing the German defensive line and finishing the war by Christmas. Although it failed to achieve its ultimate goal of a swift entry into Germany, the Allies gained some strategic territory in the Netherlands, which helped facilitate subsequent operations in the region. In December 1944, Germany launched a counter-offensive in the Ardennes, intending to split the Allied lines, to capture the vital port of Antwerp, and encircle and destroy several Allied armies. The Allies were taken completely off guard. The initial German assault achieved significant success, penetrating deep into the Allied lines and creating a large, outward protrusion or bulge in the front line. This bulge extended westward through the Ardennes forest and into Belgium, giving the battle its name. Initially it seemed like Hitler's gamble would pay off. But as the weather improved, the Allies were able to bring their air superiority to bear, attacking supply lines, enemy troops, and armored units. Supply lines were already overextended, and the Germans didn't have enough fuel to sustain the offensive. The Germans failed to achieve their strategic objectives and were pushed back, but this battle, which lasted until January 1945, was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in this war. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union had turned the tide against the Germans at the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. By the end of the year, the Soviets executed the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive to retake Ukraine and other Eastern European territories. As the Germans retreated, they too scorched the earth, destroying railroads, bridges, and other infrastructure to hamper the Soviet advance. But by November, the Soviets recaptured Kiev, pushing the Germans out of Ukraine and towards Romania and Poland. Stalin was able to turn his attention towards the north, where Leningrad was still under blockade and the population starving. After a siege of 2.5 years, Leningrad, former capital of Russia, was finally liberated. Soon after, the Soviets had also retaken Crimea. In June 1944, Stalin launched Operation Bagration, named after Pyotr Bagration, a Russian general during the Napoleonic Wars. Like Stalin, he was also of Georgian origin. With the Germans now fighting on two fronts against three formidable foes, the Germans began losing ground in the east at a record pace. German Army Group Center was destroyed, and the Soviets recaptured much of Belarus and parts of Poland, pushing westward to the Vistula River by late summer. As the Red Army rolled on, they uncovered the first ghastly sites of the Nazi extermination camps in Poland. There is evidence the Allies had knowledge of the Holocaust prior to this, but the full scale could not have been known. Nearby, in Warsaw, the Polish resistance attempted to liberate the city from the German occupation. Despite being nearby, the Soviet Red Army did not provide assistance. The Polish Home Army was anti-communist, so for Stalin, it was better to let enemy clash with enemy. By October, the Germans regrouped and defeated the Polish Home Army, destroying the city and mass murdering up to 200,000 civilians. During the wait, the Red Army shifted their goals north, capturing the Baltic states, and south, to spread communism to the Balkans. Here lay the Axis allies of Romania, Bulgaria, and the states from the partitioned Yugoslavia. Romania was the first to fall as the Red Army captured Bucharest and secured its oil production. Next, Red armies marched on Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, as German troops in Greece retreated to avoid being surrounded. By late 1944, the Soviets had moved into most of the Baltic states, the Balkans, and Poland, creating their communist buffer state between them and Germany. In the Pacific, the Japanese still reigned supreme, but after Midway and Guadalcanal, the tide shifted. The Allied strategy in the Pacific, known as island hopping, aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and capture strategically important islands. The strategy aimed to isolate and bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions, facilitating the Allies' advance toward the Philippines and ultimately Japan. Operation Cartwheel launched in mid-1943, with the primary goal of neutralizing the significant Japanese base on New Britain Island, near Papua New Guinea. The operation consisted of two main phases: the seizure of the Central Solomons, including New Georgia and Bougainville, and advances in New Guinea. Soon, the majority of the Marshall Islands were also captured. The next island hop was to the Marianas. At the Battle of Saipan in summer 1944, the Americans aimed to secure the Mariana Islands as a base to launch bombing raids straight at the Japanese homeland. The location was also crucial in blocking Japan from their colonies in Southeast Asia. The Japanese High Command recognized the American invasion as a direct threat to the Japanese homeland and launched a counteroffensive. This culminated in a major fleet engagement at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in which the Imperial Navy hoped to destroy a significant portion of U.S. aircraft carriers. This encounter resulted in a decisive and lopsided victory for the United States, allowing the Allies to capture the Marianas soon after. With the near-total destruction of their carriers, the Japanese could no longer conduct large-scale air operations. Instead of moving on to the next island, Taiwan, the Americans decided on liberating the Philippines from Japan first. After all, General MacArthur had made his promise to return 3 years earlier. In late October 1944, American troops landed on Leyte in the east and quickly secured the island. But the Japanese attempted a counterattack, resulting in one of the largest naval battles in history. The battle resulted in the near-complete destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. These losses were irreplaceable for Japan, which struggled with depleted resources and industrial capacity. This battle also marked the first organized use of the Divine Wind Special Attack Unit, or kamikaze. These were Japanese volunteers who brought back the old sense of Japanese honor, pledging to die in a blaze of glory in order to help the empire. In a desperate gamble to stop the fearsome U.S. Navy, kamikaze units would fly their aircraft into American warships, causing a great explosion. Kamikaze attacks also occurred on land, as the Japanese strapped bombs to themselves and launched their bodies underneath American tanks. The Battle of Leyte would last another 2 months before the Americans secured the entire island. Soon, American troops landed on the main island and marched towards the capital of Manila. The Japanese remained in the city and fought to the death. Once a beautiful city, the historic capital was reduced to rubble, while over 100,000 civilians were killed. It remains the largest urban battle fought by the United States. The battle for the Philippines was won, but the cost was high. Japan was now in Allied sights. But how would they invade? The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, in Crimea, was a crucial meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin as the war neared its end. Britain and the United States were encroaching from the west, while the Soviets from the east, and it was clear Germany had no recourse. The focus shifted from strategy to post-war reconstruction and the political reorganization of Europe. The leaders agreed to divide Germany into occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, with Berlin also divided into different sectors. Roosevelt also asked Stalin for military assistance against the Japanese in the east, in exchange for territories on the coast and railroad rights in Manchuria. The structure and function of a new organization was developed, which would later become the United Nations. But Roosevelt would not live to see it. Back in Western Europe, the Allies had assembled on the Rhine with a ticket to Germany. Hitler had ordered all the bridges to be destroyed, using the Rhine as his last natural defense. But as American armies explored the south, they were astonished to find the Ludendorff Bridge still intact, as the demolition failed to destroy the bridge completely. Seizing the moment, American troops quickly moved to cross the bridge over the Rhine. The bridge finally collapsed on March 17, but by then, the Allies had established a strong position across the river. American General George Patton also conducted a quick nighttime crossing in the south, facing minimal resistance. It came just a day before the British crossing, reportedly to take some of the luster from it, as intense rivalries brewed between Montgomery and American generals. Montgomery's crossing was further north, from the Netherlands, where the Rhine was much wider. So the famous king of set-piece operations prepared a meticulous three-army assault, including bombers, paratroopers, and artillery. The Germans fought back ferociously, knocking gliders out of the air, but the crossing enabled the 21st Army Group to push into the Ruhr industrial heartland of Germany. Back in the east, the Soviet steamroller continued their capture of Poland, and then split its forces. One group raced west towards Berlin, while another went south, towards Hungary, and another rolled into East Prussia to the north. As they blitzed across Poland, they uncovered and liberated the Auschwitz extermination camp, bringing to light the full extent of the Holocaust. As the Red Army crossed into Germany, it created mass panic. And with good cause, as they moved west, the Soviets committed atrocities of their own, including the targeting of civilians and refugees, and the shipment of Germans back to the Soviet Union to work in labor camps. To the south, the Red Army had easily taken Hungary and was moving north towards Vienna, the Austrian capital prior to annexation. Germany was now thoroughly surrounded, and the final offensive against Berlin was about to begin. Instead of a straight dash towards the capital, the Allies could not afford the losses a direct attack would bring, and concentrated on capturing strategic locations in western and southern Germany, such as the Ruhr industrial region. As the Americans advanced to the south, the Canadian First Army, part of Montgomery's British Army Group, launched operations to liberate the remaining areas of the Netherlands in the north and west. As the noose tightened, Hitler became increasingly more erratic and confined to the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. As Berlin braced for its inevitable fall, the Allies found themselves mourning the loss of a towering figure. While sitting for a portrait, President Franklin Roosevelt suffered from a terrible headache. He was carried to his bedroom, and doctors were immediately summoned. But the immense stress and workload of leading the nation through the war took a significant toll on his health. President Roosevelt had suffered a stroke and passed away on the afternoon of April 12. His over 12 years in office is testament to why he is widely regarded as one of the greatest American presidents. But the death of the leader of one of the three major Allied powers gave Hitler a small sense of hope. But by mid-April, the Soviets had destroyed it. The Berlin suburbs were attacked from the south by General Konev, while Zhukov's army in the east started shelling the city on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. Stalin deliberately encouraged competition between the two marshals, suggesting that the first to reach Berlin would receive the most glory. It only took 5 days for them to encircle the city. As the Western armies continued pushing east, the Americans and Soviets finally met at the River Elbe. It was a momentous occasion, as soldiers from very different worlds celebrated a moment of warmth and solidarity. If only they knew, as they clasped hands in unity, that the very German ground beneath their boots would soon become the fault line of a divided world. German forces, including remnants of the army and the SS, along with local militias and Hitler Youth units, mounted a desperate defense. Combat was brutal, as soldiers fought from house to house and street to street. The German defenders were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Reichstag building was captured by Soviet troops and the red flag hoisted for all to see. Adolf Hitler, confined to the Führerbunker beneath the Chancellery, was helpless. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler, knowing the end was near, committed suicide, his unwavering final statement denouncing international Jewry. Eva Braun, his longtime mistress and wife of just a day, died alongside him, with their dog, Blondie, a German shepherd. Propaganda minister, Goebbels, committed suicide with his wife Magda, after poisoning their 6 children. Magda so praised the Führer that all her children had names that began with the letter H. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945, at Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower's headquarters in France, marking the end of the war in Europe. To satisfy the Soviet demand for a more formal surrender process, a second surrender ceremony was held in Berlin a day later. Hostilities ceased as of midnight on May 8, which became Victory in Europe Day. Upon the announcement of Germany's surrender, celebrations erupted in Allied countries. People took to the streets in cities across the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Allied nations, celebrating the end of the war in Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Now was the time to rebuild. Back in Asia, the war still raged on. On the Southeast Asian mainland, the Allies, including British, Indian, Chinese, and American forces, launched several counteroffensives from 1943 to 1945 during the Burma Campaign. Earlier in the war, the Japanese had captured Rangoon, severing the Burma Road, a vital supply route to the Chinese. Forced to retreat to India, Allied forces regrouped under General William Slim, planning counteroffensives and guerrilla operations. Early Allied attempts to recapture coastal areas in the Arakan region failed, but subsequent campaigns in 1944 achieved progress. Special forces, including the Chindits and American-led Chinese troops, conducted disruptive missions behind Japanese lines. The turning point came with the battles of Imphal and Kohima during the spring and summer, where Allied forces broke a Japanese siege, halting their advance into India and weakening their hold on Burma. In late 1944, the Allies launched operations to recapture northern and central Burma, and later the capital of Rangoon in the south. By March 1945, William Slim's forces captured Mandalay, securing central Burma. Chinese forces recaptured the northeast, but were halted by the monsoons, as the British continued south, crossing the Irrawaddy River, and approaching Rangoon by May. There, they were joined by other Imperial British troops, including Gurkhas and Indian fighters. But as they entered Rangoon, they discovered the Japanese had abandoned it. They retook the city with little resistance. The successful Burma campaign restored control over the region and re-established vital supply routes. The next stop was a planned offensive on Malaya, but the war in the Pacific would change Allied plans. In the Pacific, surrounded and blocked off from raw materials, it was now Japan itself that was under threat. Iwo Jima became strategically important for both the United States and Japan. The island hosted 2 Japanese airfields, and a third was under construction. On February 19, 1945, U.S. Marines landed on its beaches. But they were heavily fortified, with the Japanese employing a network of bunkers, hidden artillery, and extensive tunnels. The Japanese strategy involved allowing the Americans to land with minimal opposition, and then engage them with well-prepared defensive positions. But the Americans kept fighting across all kinds of barriers, both Japanese and natural. One of the most iconic moments of the battle occurred on February 23, when U.S. Marines raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi, the highest point on the island. This event was captured in a famous photograph and became a symbol of American perseverance and victory. It was again recreated using a bigger flag. Despite the symbolic victory, fighting continued for several more weeks. The Japanese defenders used the island's network of caves and tunnels to launch counterattacks and ambushes, but ultimately failed to resist the Americans. The capture of Iwo Jima provided the US with a base for fighter escorts and an emergency landing site for bombers attacking Japan before an inevitable invasion. But out of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers, only 216 were taken prisoner. It was clear the Japanese were willing to defend their territory to the last man. This made the Americans rethink the potential costs of an invasion of the Japanese home islands. They decided to use a tactic seen on the Western Front in Europe: strategic bombing. Japan had been out of range of American bombers, but an upgrade to the B-17 Flying Fortress was introduced just in time. This was the B-29 Superfortress. It was used sparsely in 1944, and wasn't very effective until the Americans switched to incendiary bombs. The raid on Tokyo on March 9th resulted in one of the deadliest and most destructive bombings in history, as the wooden domiciles in the Japanese capital erupted in flame. This raid, called Operation Meeting House, is considered the single most destructive bombing raid in history, with an estimated 100,000 civilians killed and over 1 million more left homeless. The raids on Osaka, occurring a few days later, also caused extensive damage and further weakened Japan's ability to continue the war. But as the American bombers had no escorts and needed to fly at low altitude, they were easily countered by Japanese fighters. Though they had secured Iwo Jima, it was clear the strategic bombing campaign wouldn't work. The Americans resigned themselves to the one thing they had hoped to avoid: a full-scale invasion. Okinawa was the largest of the Ryukyu Islands and provided a strategic location for the Allies to launch a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Capturing Okinawa would give the Allies a base for air operations and a staging area for troops and supplies. After a week of bombardment, US forces began landing on the beaches of Okinawa on April 1st, or L-Day. The initial landings were met with surprisingly light resistance, as Japanese forces had withdrawn to the interior of the island to prepare for a more tenacious defense. The Japanese strategy, under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima, involved a deep defense in the southern part of the island. This included a network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions designed to inflict maximum casualties on the attacking forces. The battle saw some of the fiercest fighting of the Pacific War. The Japanese once again launched extensive kamikaze attacks against the Allied fleet supporting the invasion, causing significant damage to ships and resulted in considerable loss of life among Allied sailors. Despite fierce resistance, US forces gradually advanced, capturing key positions and inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese defenders. The battle concluded with the capture of the southern portion of Okinawa and the defeat of the remaining Japanese forces by June 22. General Mitsuru Ushijima committed suicide. The Battle of Okinawa became the deadliest battle in the Pacific, with over 50,000 Allied casualties and over 100,000 for the Japanese. The Allies now had the daunting task of invading the Japanese homeland. But despite suffering heavy losses and facing defeat, Japan showed no signs of surrendering. Intelligence reports suggested that Japan was preparing for a massive defense, including mobilizing civilians. It was estimated that an invasion could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States the same day as Roosevelt's death, and took on the responsibility of leading the country through the final stages of the war. Doing so meant making difficult decisions. Faced with the prospect of a costly invasion of Japan and seeking to force a quick end to the war, President Truman decided to use the fruits of the top-secret Manhattan Project initiative. This was the program to develop atomic bombs, harnessing the power unleashed when an atom was split. Under the leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, and with contributions from the UK and Canada, the project had achieved significant scientific breakthroughs. By mid-1945, two types of bombs were successfully created. Faced with the prospect of a costly invasion of Japan and seeking to force a quick end to the war, President Truman decided to use the new weapon. A final ultimatum for unconditional surrender was ignored by the Japanese, and a week later, on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, a uranium bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more died within the following days and weeks. Truman issued another ultimatum for Japan to surrender, but there was radio silence. On August 9th, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki. Though it fell far from its target, it was much more powerful than Little Boy and resulted in approximately 40,000 to 75,000 immediate deaths. The Americans again threatened continued bombings. And to make matters worse, the Japanese had to deal with an old enemy. On August 9th, the Soviets launched a multi-pronged offensive into Manchukuo, Inner Mongolia, and northern Korea. The invasion was part of the Allied strategy to defeat Japan and fulfill the promises made at the Yalta Conference, where the Soviet Union agreed to enter the war against Japan. The Japanese Kwantung Army was significantly weakened by the transfer of many units to other fronts and lacked its earlier strength. The combined shock of the atomic bombings and the rapid Soviet advance into Manchuria shattered the Japanese military's confidence in their ability to continue the war. The Japanese High Command realized that their strategic situation had become untenable. Japanese leadership, including Emperor Hirohito, faced intense pressure to find a way to end the war. On August 14, 1945, after intense discussions and debates within the Japanese government, Emperor Hirohito intervened to urge acceptance of the Allies' terms for unconditional surrender. Japan formally surrendered on August 15, 1945, which became known as Victory over Japan, or VJ Day. Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time the Japanese people had heard his voice. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, where representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender, officially ending World War II. Despite the end of the war, the Soviets continued their advance, capturing as much territory as they could. The Soviet Red Army swiftly occupied Japanese-controlled Manchuria, dismantled Japanese military and industrial infrastructure, and shipped assets back to the Soviet Union. The Soviets eventually withdrew, and the Chinese Communist forces took control of the region, bolstering their position in the Chinese Civil War, which we will get to in our final mega-documentary. Korea, annexed by Japan back in 1910, was also occupied by Soviet forces north of the 38th parallel. This line was agreed upon with the United States, which occupied the southern part of Korea. The division laid the groundwork for the establishment of two separate states, later to become North and South Korea. World War II resulted in staggering casualties and immense human suffering across the globe. It remains the deadliest war in human history, with up to 85 million wiped out. The majority of these were civilians, anywhere from 50 to 55 million dead. With 20 to 27 million total deaths, the Soviet Union suffered the most out of any other power. Poland, between both the Nazis and Soviets, lost around 17% of its population, roughly 1 in 6. After the war, millions of ethnic Germans who had settled in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states, were forcibly expelled as part of the effort to redraw national boundaries. The Potsdam Conference of 1945 sanctioned these population transfers, and approximately 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were displaced. Many faced harsh conditions during their journey and resettlement, with significant numbers dying from malnutrition, disease, and violence. Those who survived were resettled in post-war Germany, often in dire circumstances. Similarly, Japanese settlers and colonists were expelled from territories Japan had occupied during the war, including Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and various Pacific islands. A significant consequence of the Second World War was the accelerated decolonization in British and French colonies. Enormous financial strain on Britain and France left them heavily indebted and struggling with reconstruction costs, and it was clear they no longer had the ability to maintain overseas colonies. Many colonized people served in Allied forces, gaining military experience and a broader perspective on global politics, which fueled nationalist aspirations for self-determination. The Potsdam Conference, held from July 17 to August 2, 1945, in Germany, included President Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt, Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee after the UK general election, and Stalin. This conference took place after Germany fell, but before the Japanese surrender. The leaders confirmed the division of Germany and Berlin and agreed on the demilitarization, denazification, and democratization of Germany, as well as the reparations to be paid. But beneath the smiles was an underlying sense of animosity, as Truman had revealed to Stalin that America had developed a terrifying new weapon. Stalin, on the other hand, was determined to secure Soviet interests in Eastern Europe and ensure that the Soviet Union would not face future threats from Germany or the West. The conference highlighted the growing divide between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, setting the stage for another type of war, which would dominate global politics for the next several decades. But for now, the Allies had achieved their victory, and the world was at peace. But for how long?